Hey, folks, we're moving on. We're now on Unit 4, Lecture 5, which in the book, in case you're reading the book, is Chapter 15, Section 1. We are going to talk about struggle in Latin America. So far in this unit, we've been talking about war over here. So, at the same time that there was war over here, there was a whole bunch of struggle going on over here in the world that had nothing to do with World War I. It was just completely different struggles. Well, some of it has to do with World War I. We'll get on. But what I mean is these countries were not in the Allies or the Central Powers. So wars going on over here. And now I'm going to talk to you about what was going on in this part of the world at that time. Okay. So we have to go back in time a bit. Do you remember Napoleon Bonaparte and his whole revolution, and how in the very, very, very end of the whole French Revolution, it was all kind of for nothing because they wound up with what? A king again. And then years later, Napoleon's nephew, who was Napoleon III, Napoleon III is now the king of France. And Mexico had made some European countries mad at them. And Napoleon III sent this guy named Maximilian over to be the Emperor of Mexico. He was the one and only Emperor of Mexico ever. So, but then there was a Mexican rise up, and he was killed in 1867. Maximilian was assassinated in 1867. And for the next 10 years, there was a whole bunch of unrest in Mexico. And then this guy, Porfirio Diaz, we talked about him before. Porfirio Diaz took charge. He was this really strict, powerful, strong ruler. And he ruled Mexico for 35 years. You'll read that he was repeatedly elected for 35 years. And that is true. He was elected. They held elections, but very few people were actually allowed to vote. So if they couldn't vote, then, I mean, if the masses of people couldn't vote and only a select few people could vote, sure, I mean, he kept getting reelected, but not really by the people. So he was the leader of Mexico for 35 years. And hold on. I'm going to rewrite his name. Porfirio Diaz. Now I'm going to flash forward to the year 1910. Porfirio Diaz ruled for 35 years. And during his rule, Mexico got richer and richer. But what exactly does that mean? That means rich people got richer and richer. The rich got richer. The middle stayed in the middle, and the poor either stayed poor or lots of them got more poor. More poor. So the rich got richer and richer and richer and richer and richer. But remember, there aren't very many rich people. Let's draw a little diagram here. If this is all the people, this is the rich. And maybe This is the middle. And everyone else are the poor. So all these people stayed poor, poor, poor. These people kept getting richer and richer and richer and richer and richer. And the middle just kind of stayed the middle. And because of this, during this time, anger, like resentment, grew among the rich people because they wanted to be even richer. And they reached this point where they couldn't really get too much richer. Why is that? We've talked about it before, because who actually owns the factories? The US and Great Britain. The US and Great Britain, they control almost everything. And the rich of Mexico, they don't like that because they want to just keep getting even more and more and more rich. And the middle class resents Diaz because they want to vote. And the poor resent Diaz because they're poor. So this guy, Francisco, let's start a new page. Francisco Madero. He was an army officer. Francisco Madero, this army officer, threatens that he's going to rise up and overthrow Diaz. And there's this great rebellion brewing. People are ready to overthrow Diaz. So Diaz abdicates. Diaz abdicates because Francisco Madero is threatening to overthrow him. Now, for the next 10 years, there is a bloody revolutionary fight in Mexico. It's awful. People that liked Madero are fighting people that liked Diaz, and then there were all your other people that want different things, and they were all fighting each other, and it was awful. Then, in 1917, finally, the revolution kind of starts to calm down. And this guy, Venustiano Venustiano, there we are, Venustiano Carranza. Venustiano Carranza is elected president of Mexico. And he signed a constitution that he didn't really want to sign, but the people were demanding it, and so he did. And this constitution, it's the Constitution of 1917. It was mainly, it discussed land, religion, and labor. The Constitution said that some land was going to be taken away from the rich and given to the poor. So these people that have been living in just abject poverty with nothing for a very, very long time were finally going to get their land back that had been taken from them. If you remember before, that the rich people were just buying up all the land and then renting it out to the Americans and the British. So the poor were going to get some land. Religion, the Catholic Church had really dominated Mexican government for a long, long time. And the Constitution said that the church was going to get less power. And for labor, we got minimum wage. Women still didn't have many rights, but this Constitution said that if a woman was doing the same job as a man, then she should be paid the same. And there were some talks about medical care and, you know, basic wages, just making life for the everyday person a little bit better. But fighting continued all through the 20s, all through the 1920s, because some people liked Carranza and some people didn't like him, and everybody was upset, lots and lots of fighting. In 1920, Carranza was overthrown. I should have said that first. So he was elected and he signed this Constitution in 1917, but three years later, he was overthrown. And then for the entire next decade, fighting continued. Then after that, a new party was formed, a new political party. Called PRI, which is the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And it's not IRP because of how the Spanish language works. In English, it's the Institutional Revolutionary Party, but in Spanish, it would say the Party of Revolutionary Institution, like that. So PRI, make sure and know this, know who PRI are. Now, let's think about how governments often like to name their parties something that they're really not. We learned about that in the last lecture, the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik means majority, but they were actually a very small minority. So Institutional Revolutionary Party, they presented themselves as this political party that was for the people. And they were going to create massive revolution and everything was going to change and life was going to be better. Yeah, it didn't work out that way. They kept all the power. And I mean, I can't say they were a dictator because they were more than one person. It was a political party, but they kept all the power to themselves. They would give little trinkets of power to small minorities to make them feel better. But PRI kept all the power in Mexico. And PRI ruled Mexico from the 1930s all the way until the year 2000. So just to give you guys an idea of that, my grandparents were born in the 1930s, and I was already 6 or 7 years older than you in 2000. So PRI ruled through my grandparents' entire lifetime, my parents' entire lifetime, and probably a third of my lifetime. So in the 30s, this PRI president named Lázaro Cardenas, he started actually enforcing some of the things that had been signed in the Constitution in 1917. You know, the Constitution of 1917, it sounded great and it was signed, but none of it was really done. So in the 1930s, Larazo Cárdenas, this guy, he knew that if he wanted to keep power, he was going to have to do some of these things for the people. You have to do some things to make your people happy, or else there's going to be another revolution. So he did a redistribution of the land. Redistribution of the land, where he took some land away from the rich and gave some to the poor. Education was big. At this time, the masses of Mexico were completely illiterate. There was no school for anybody except the rich. So he built schools, he built libraries for education, and he did one great thing for Mexico. In 1938, he nationalized their oil. The United States and Great Britain were not happy about this, because we're talking the 1938, 1930s, cars were already around and cars run on oil. And so Great Britain and the US were going down to Mexico, taking their oil and turning around and selling it to their own people. Mexico said, nope, 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 nope. You're not going to do that anymore. This is our oil from our land. And the US and Great Britain were really mad about it. But Mexico ended up paying the US and paying Great Britain a whole bunch of money. And so the US and Great Britain said, okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about nationalism. Nationalism in Latin America. In the 20s and 30s, these are the 1920s and 30s, trade fell drastically in Mexico because they traded a lot with Europe. They sold a whole bunch of their stuff to Europe. But now what's going on in Europe? They're broke and they're rebuilding from World War I. So Europe used to send all this money to Mexico to buy their stuff. Not anymore. They can't afford it. Europe is just focusing on rebuilding. And then in 1929, there was the Great Depression in the US. So now the Americans can't afford to buy anything from Mexico. So the Europeans aren't buying anything and the US isn't buying anything, and Mexico's struggling with that. And so they did this thing called economic nationalism. Economic nationalism means Mexico said, buy Mexican first. And instead of, I don't know, buying their shoes from some factory in the United States, Mexico built their own shoe factory and they made their own shoes. And they encouraged all Mexicans to only buy things made in Mexico. Mexico first. And they also put a really high tariff on anyone bringing their stuff in. Like, let's say France wants to bring in a bunch of coffee mugs to Mexico and sell their coffee mugs. Well, Mexico charged France a tariff for every coffee cup that you bring into our country and you try to sell, you have to give us so much money. That's what a tariff is. But they charged really high tariffs. And so it made other countries not so interested in bringing their stuff in. High tariffs and a Mexico first policy for their economy. And it worked pretty well in Mexico. The thing is that economic nationalism spread to other Latin American countries. Didn't really work so well in all of them because there was a great unequal distribution of the wealth. It worked out just fine for the rich people. It helped them stay rich and get richer. Didn't work out so well for the lower classes. And because of those problems, those economic problems all across Latin America, let's go back over to the map and I'm gonna zoom in. A whole bunch of these countries in here, plus all the ones down here. I'm talking about all of them. But here's Mexico. And through a whole bunch of these countries, because finances were so bad, and then so the economy was bad, problems started happening in politics. And these people in these countries, they all decided that maybe the liberal, democratic, individualist, European/United States way of running politics, maybe that's not really the way to go. And so the strong leaders, dictators took over lots of these countries. And at first, the people supported them. The people supported them because they wanted their country to do better. And they believed this powerful leader would come in and help them. So there was also a change. Hold on, I have to go back to my, all right. So that was, let's see, we've covered economic nationalism, which led to political nationalism. And at the same time, there was cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism was this big movement of, for a really, really long time now, centuries, European culture has heavily influenced Latin American culture. And this movement of pride in oneself has finally established itself, and writers and artists and great thinkers, philosophers started to go back to traditional Latin American ways of thinking, Latin American art styles, Latin American music styles, they were trying to pull away from Europe and have their own identity. And then, so now we've got, we are during World War I right now, and we're talking about Latin America. During World War I, Great Britain was investing less and less in Mexico. And that's because, I'm sorry, I don't mean Mexico, I mean Latin America, all of Latin America. Great Britain was investing less and less in Latin America because they were kind of fighting a war on the other side of the ocean over where they were. They're fighting a war here. They can't really be investing over here. They don't have enough money for that. So, but the United States, who, remember, for most of the war, wasn't really involved in it. So as Great Britain is backing out of Latin America, the US is investing more and more. So the United States has this great financial hold over Latin America. And during the Mexican Revolution, the United States spent a lot of money funding the people, the side that they wanted to fund. But they did that all over Latin America. The United States, they were still calling themselves the world police. The US still considered themselves the world police. And all over Latin America, when there was any kind of a revolution or social unrest of any kind, the United States swooped right in there. And they sent soldiers and they sent money and they sent arms to help the side that they were interested in siding with. And then this huge anti-United States feeling was all over Latin America. And at that time, the president, so by now, World War I was over in 1918. All of this was happening all the way to the 1930s. And US President Franklin Roosevelt, this guy comes up with the Good Neighbor Policy. The Good Neighbor Policy. And this policy, he says, we're going to stop interfering so much with Latin America. We're going to pull our troops out of Haiti. We're going to pull our troops out of Nicaragua, and we're going to cease the Platt Agreement. So, pulled troops out of Haiti, out of Nicaragua, and ended the Platt Agreement. Hopefully you guys remember what the Platt Agreement is, but just in case you don't, the Platt Agreement was when Cuba wanted independence from Spain, and the US said, oh yeah, we'll totally help you out with that. And so the US helped Cuba fight Spain in the Spanish-American War, but then the United States went, ha ha, Cuba, you have to do all this stuff for us. And the US had lots of military control in Cuba. And so Franklin Roosevelt said, we're ending the Platt Agreement. We're going to pull out of Cuba. You have your freedom now. They pulled troops out of Haiti. They pulled troops out of Nicaragua. And they agreed that they weren't going to play this police thing anymore. They were going to be a lot more respectful to their neighbors in the South. They were going to be good neighbors. That's the Good Neighbor Policy. And this really did serve to improve relationships with a lot of Latin American countries and the United States. That is it for Latin America. I will see you soon.